Welcome back, or if this is your first episode to the Game Dev Show, then welcome. My name is Luke Greenaway, and this is season 2. Essentially, the Game Dev Show is a podcast where Kaylee, my co-host, and we meet and sit down with some of the games industry's most influential people, and they take us through their journeys. This week, we're joined by one of the RPG greats, Preston Watamaniuk. I hope I pronounced that correctly. We cover everything from his work on the Mass Effect series, Neverwinter Nights, and other BioWare projects, to his graft and his humble beginnings in waste disposal. And yeah, it's for me personally, I'm a huge RPG fan, so let's dive in.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning and have you tell us about where you grew up, what you were like as a kid, and how you got into games.
So this is a shockingly unique story that you're about to hear, which for someone who was born in that time, which is I'm 52 years old, so I'm born in 1968. So there is an explosion of awesome stuff in the late 70s. If you're a nerd, which I will be honest, I had a pretty severely nerdy vibe when I was young. There was only two things at that point that I could latch onto, and that was Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. So the first book I ever read was Lord of the Rings, even though I shouldn't have. I was too young to read it. It took me halfway through the books before I realized, oh, wait, Sauron and Saruman, they're not the same guy. That's when I knew I was too young to be reading these books. But anyways, and then Star Trek, which was like CBC played Star Trek reruns every Saturday at 4:00 religiously. And
were you a Riker guy? You kind of have a Riker beard.
No, old Star Trek.
Okay.
Old Star Trek, like the original series, like we're talking like mid 70s. You know, I'm like 8 years old, 9 years old, and I'd go down and I'd wait because, you know, whatever sporting event was on was about to end, and then 4:00 Star Trek. Yeah. And so I loved Star Trek because it felt, and this is kind of a theme to a lot of the questions, is that it felt authentic. Lord of the Rings felt authentic. Star Trek felt authentic. And then along comes late 70s, you have Star Wars. And Star Wars, for all of its incredible achievements, one of its big ones, which I don't know if it gets enough credit for, is that it felt like an authentic experience unto itself. It felt like a real thing, like they had just filmed something that was real and then put it up on that screen for us, right? And my uncle, who was youngish at that time, he loved that movie. And he would just do a circuit around the city, and he would just grab all of the cousins, you know, who lived in the city. And then we would just trundle off and we'd see Star Wars. And I ended up seeing it like 12 times in the theater, wow. You know, back before you could just sort of download it on your iPad and watch it in your basement, right? But I mean, there was that. And then when I was 10 or 11, I was diagnosed with a heart murmur. So back then that involved like leeches and you know, various medieval mechanisms to try and fix that. You know, my mother realized, I don't think this is going to go well for a 10-year-old boy having to be still for extended periods of time. And so she actually bought me this game called Dungeons and Dragons. And so she gave me the box set of the original blue box set of Dungeons and Dragons. And she's like, hey, you know, this is probably something you'd enjoy. I've heard about it. So I opened that up, and then like so many other thousands and thousands of game developers, it was like, wow, you mean there's a social activity now that is kind of like, I get to use my imagination to play a game. So it's another authentic experience, right? And it's just all of these, the late 70s, early 80s, you have like the rise of these kind of interesting authentic IPs like Aliens, Predator, you know, Blade Runner, all of these really well developed IPs that are just like, they fire your imagination, right? And so Dungeons and Dragons did the same thing. It was very social. And I had always loved games. My mother will tell you that the first time I made a game, I was 4 years old. Whether that's true or not, and I think she's probably being very loose about the term, like, I put a square and there was another square with a number. That's a game. You know, we're being generous, I think, if we call that a game. But my family, weirdly, like, I loved games and I was obsessed with games, but my family wasn't. And so it's like, hey, do you want to play a game? And they would be like, nah, I'm okay. I would be like, okay, well, If I can't play a game, I'll make a game. So I would do game design just because it was like playing a game, only, the other side of it, right? And then, eventually that turned into Dungeons and Dragons. Was like, oh, wow, okay. You mean I can build an entire world and have it be a game? That's really cool. And so I started playing around with building my own world, my own IP. And that kept me pretty busy through like junior high and high school when I probably, I should probably have been playing a bit more sports, but I didn't, and things like that. But it was just, I loved that, like other guys would go out and spend time out doing whatever on a Saturday night. And I'd be like, well, I'm going to spend 11 hours balancing this weapons table that doesn't work in my game. Right. So, and luckily my parents were always extremely supportive of me in that. Like my mom is, she's been involved in the arts her whole life. She loves the idea that there's games where you can use your imagination, and there's, so she was all like, there's never been this idea where other people have run up against the idea that, well, why are you doing that? Why are you playing games? Why are you making games? Why are you doing all of this? She was like, no, this is clearly what you're meant to do, and I'm going to support you in that. So both my parents were amazing for that. And then in around that time, I visited my uncle, who was a big tech person. And around that time, that Star Wars time, and there was this little thing he had in his house called the Apple IIe. And I was like, ooh, what's this? And he was like, Clea, let me show you this. And he shows me this game called Lode Runner. I don't know if you know that game, but it's old. It's an old Apple IIe game. And I was like, this is amazing. This whole video game thing, this is awesome. Because he had Pong. He got the original Pong machine. So I'd played Pong at his house. And I played that. I remember this distinctly because my whole family was going to go see the spruce, that you go see the Spruce Goose and the Queen Mary down in California. It's just a thing you go do back then. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I'm going to sit here. And I sat there and I played Lode Runner for 12 hours straight.
Jeez.
just like, I was like, this is amazing. Like, so you have all these like simultaneous influences kind of landing on you almost at exactly the same time. You have Dungeons and Dragons, you have video games, you have Star Wars, and they're all hitting you right around that time when you're like, you want to latch onto something as a teenager and say, well, this is what I'm about. So it was like a lot of other people. It was just, man, it was easy and it was awesome, and it really shaped the way I thought about everything. Right.
So I'm curious, though, you had this support and enthusiasm from your parents, but then, and maybe it's just a function of what was available at the time, you ended up going to school for poli-sci instead of for anything related to games.
Well, because back then there was nothing related to games.
That's kind of what I was thinking. So that was just kind of, you found that and you're like, I can do this. I'm interested in this.
Well, no, it was because it was related to game design.
Oh, interesting.
So
I'm ready to hear this explanation of how poli-sci and game design relate.
So by trade, I came up and I'm basically what BioWare calls a systems designer. That's how I got started. So like Neverwinter Nights, you write all the spell scripts, you balance feats. I did the CR formula. So when you plug in all your monster stats and everything, it would say the CR for this is like 20, right? I was the one who did that on Neverwinter Nights. I love systems design. And what I've only just recently understood, like, in part because of the questions you're asking, and part because of the way that I started thinking, is like, I love putting things together. I love figuring out how things are connected. And poli-sci is literally take fuzzy, weird, human relationships and then build a system that explains them, right? It's like, this is where you get the communism. Communism and fascism are just, two sides of the same coin sort of thing, right? And so it was about, I liked figuring things out. And poli-sci also, I liked military history. I liked military strategy. And then there were courses there that allowed me to sort of, learn more about that stuff, which applies, directly to game design. It was that. I mean, like in high school, you have to put down in your yearbook, like, well, what are you going to do? What do you want to do? And it was like, you could give a fake answer, but I figured, well, I'll be real. I'll be true unto myself for this moment in public. And I just put down, I want to be a game designer.
Whoa.
So I And I didn't know how that was going to be possible. And I didn't even know if it was something that could happen, but that's what I wanted to do. And I knew that even then, like that I wanted to be a game designer. So poli-sci was basically a way to train your brain to think about the relationship between things. I got out of school, and at that point, tons of jobs for poli-sci graduates, just tons, right? Sarcasm. But the thing that I did, I had worked like at Public Works during the summer mowing lawns. It was a great summer job, and my wife had just started law school. So what I ended up doing is I just said, you know what, I'm going to work here. It's a good, solid union job. She can get through law school with no student loans, and then we're on the other side of that, and we're in a better place, right? So I ended up doing like working there for 6 years after I finished school. And it was fun because it's like, I did arena maintenance, and I got to drive the Zamboni, and which was really cool.
What?
Yeah.
That is a cool past job. Zamboni driver. That's the kind of thing you can impress your kids with. Oh, like when you're at an ice hockey game, and the thing that sort of like refinishes the ice at halftime, that's the Zamboni.
Oh, nice.
So it was fun to be, it's like, that's a Canadian experience, right? It's like a Canadian who got to drive a Zamboni. It's like, well, of course you did, right? Yeah. It's like it's like that, and I tap a tree for maple syrup, and then, But the thing is that I went from that though, and then I ended up doing garbage. I was literally a garbage man. And I did that for the majority of the time that I spent there. And it was actually a great job, barring the catastrophic, some injuries that I suffered while I was doing it. But for the most part, it was a job that I started at 7:30 and then I finished at 1:30 because there was no breaks. You just worked until you were finished, right? But what that meant, because my wife would be in law school till like 6 o'clock every day, I had a huge block of time that was my own. And so I got, I played StarCraft. I got into Magic the Gathering. I joined a gaming group, and we did role-playing events and stuff like that. It was actually perfect because it was like I was earning money. I was also getting to learn more about these new gaming, games that were coming up that, and Magic the Gathering it's a work of genius, right? Like it's just, wow, I was blown away by that. All the little mechanics and stuff like that they were using. So I was into that. I got into like, 40K and a bunch of other stuff. So it was great from that respect, which is I had a ton of free time. I spent it learning more about games, more about designing games, more about different genres of games. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had had a typical 9-to-5 job, unless I was willing to say, to my wife, I'm not going to spend as much time with you. So it was perfect because it was like I get 3.5 hours of just playing in, and then it would be like, okay, and now my wife and I, go for dinner. We can watch TV together. We can chat. So it was perfect.
But that sounds like, the dream job, being able to fit both your passion and your work in.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And I think the biggest thing was, obviously, I knew this was not a long. So when my wife finished law school and finished her articling, I was like, okay, this is not a long-term gig. One, it's not satisfying intellectually. And two, I suffered a couple of pretty bad injuries, like tore out my ankle, tore the end of my fingers off, like bad stuff, right? It's not a job you want to do for a long term. So at that point, though, I was like, okay, I want to do something else, and I want to get into games. And so I said, listen, I'm going to go back and I'm going to get some technical training so that I can do, now we would call it scripting, but it was basically, I want to be able to understand coding and programming and stuff like that. And I didn't want to go back for a full 4-year degree to become a programmer. So what I did is I took a diploma at a school here in Edmonton, which gave me what was basically a tools programming background and database design. And I loved the database design portion of it again. And I only recently made this connection, which is like, it's because it's taking the real world and putting it into a system. It's like, I need to break this very weird, complex problem down and make a thing out of it that is now understandable and usable, right? So again, it was like poli-sci, but in a completely different way. It was like coming at it almost from the exact opposite side. And that was by accident. It's kind of by accident. Maybe it was subconscious. It was like, hey, this seems like something you would enjoy. And I really did enjoy it. So halfway through that degree, I had also been, in this gaming group and whatever. And one of the guys in that gaming group worked for BioWare. And him and I, talked a lot, and I had run some events and stuff like that. So he eventually dropped my name to Ray and Greg. And I get a call from the design director there at the time. And he's like, hey, how would you like to come in and interview for a writing job? And I was like, whoa, that's amazing. But no, I can't. One, I'm a terrible writer. like any of the editors that have had to edit my copy, like they're just like, you're killing me with your grammar. Like that is not my strength. And I'm again, you got to know what your strengths are, even though like, holy crap, you're actually offering me potentially a job at a dream, at a place that I would love to work. I know that I wouldn't succeed at that job. I knew that I would not do well. But I told them, listen, I'm taking a technical degree right now and whatever. And they go, well, wait a minute. Actually, we're more interested in that. So then closer to the end of my degree, they called me in, and I had to go through a 3 or 4 interviews. The first interview was with Greg. And then I had like a series of more discipline focused interviews. And it's funny because the old studio was located on this sort of hip, interesting part of Edmonton called White Ave, but there wasn't any real parking there. So I would always park at a meter, pay the hour, but the interviews would be 2 hours. I'd come out, I'd have a parking ticket, and I'd pay the parking ticket. And I joke, it's like the best investment I ever made was these 3 to 4 parking tickets that I had to. It's like, okay, the trade-off is good. It's, like 20-year career versus 4 parking tickets. I'll take that. I'll take that as a trade-off. They were very rigorous. I felt like I had almost failed all of those interviews. Mark Dara, in the last interview, was a technical interview, and he asked me this question about linked lists. He goes, look, okay, using a linked list, how would you solve this problem? I had literally learned linked lists the day before. If he had asked me that question 2 days earlier, I would have been like, I don't even know what a linked list is. Yeah. Right? So it was just these series of really luck. Like, I have to say luck. I put in a lot of time doing stuff on my own and being semi-social about gaming. But it was just a factor. Like when guys asked me, well, how did you get into the industry? You don't want to know how I got into the industry, because I did a lot of stuff on my own, and then I got what I feel is very, very lucky.
You know what, though? Everyone I've talked to, like, no one has a linear path. And I kind of actually like that part of your path was doing something that had nothing to do with where you wanted to take your career, but it made sense for your life, and it still led to the career you wanted. I actually think that's kind of cool.
I've had the occasional person go like, oh, wow, if you had to do it over again, would you still do garbage? And I say yes, because that's a real job. That's a job where you learn very, very quickly what hard work is, what a job that can wear you down is. When you go from that to making games, and my first game that I worked on was Neverwinter Nights. I did some pretty decent crunch on that game, like, get to work at 6 a.m, come home later at night. And for the last little bit of it, it still didn't, it was like, it's not doing garbage at Christmas in -40.
Yeah.
Like, and this is not, I'm not making this one up, like -40.
Getting injured.
Getting injured, all these things, right? It's just, yeah, like, why would I even complain about this? Like, this is just, I'm getting to live a dream here. And BioWare has always been, Ray and Greg have always been and always were really, really good to me. They've always treated me really, really well, even though they didn't need to. Like, I was still a junior guy at that time. They always treated me very well. They always made sure that I was compensated well. I've never had to worry about any of that in 20 years. They've taken care of me. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that I can focus on my craft and I can focus on making games, and not sort of 50% that other jobs seem to sometimes, make you worry about and run around on.
It's so good though that you can take the time to recognize them and their input I do think it would be funny that if you're in your area after this airs, like the application to work in like garbage removal increases by like 70% or something. Everyone's like, no, that's how Preston did it.
Yeah, I don't think that'll be the case, but yeah, like but it worked out for me because I like to design games on my own time, and that gave me the time to do that. Right, it gave me that focused period of time every single day for 3 to 4 years. And garbage is not exactly a mentally taxing job, right? So it got to the point where it was just muscle memory. So even when I was doing the job, I was thinking about games.
That's so cool. I think about games all the time. But you did touch upon obviously like the parking tickets being like probably the best investment you've ever made because it's given you this 20-year career at BioWare. And it isn't just like a career, it's kind of like your RPG pedigree is outstanding. And it's interesting that you've gone through all these different factors, which have probably contributed not only to your work ethic, but also your philosophy about approaching work and the creative cycle. Within your, I suppose, your portfolio, I've got obviously a couple of personal favorites, Mass Effect 2, Baldur's Gate 2, Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic. I mean, these are like, the pinnacle of RPGs when you think of narrative-led games with incredibly groundbreaking systems at the time, whether it's just carrying story arcs over or having like decisions to make, and obviously those decisions having consequences. Do you have a particular project you look back on and you say, that was my favorite project, and why?
So BG2, I never really worked on. What I did was I started the company in the last 5 months of that project, and they had already started up Neverwinter. I went on to Neverwinter. I played BG before it was released, and I gave feedback, I think, on one quest. And so they're very generous with credits. They say, okay, well, then we'll give you another QA credit. Like that was a genius game. Like I've played BG2 so many times. I love that game. But my favorite project, it's kind of split into two because there's a project that I was a developer on, like in there doing work, and then projects I was a lead on. And I would say Neverwinter Nights is my favorite as a developer. I was made a lead shortly thereafter, actually. Neverwinter Nights was, I think, a 2 to 3 year cycle. And then Star Wars was another year. But after that, I was the lead designer for Mass Effect 1. So I didn't spend a lot of time doing content work. And so Neverwinter Nights, I got to do everything. I got to do systems design. I scripted an entire level, like the Luskan level in Neverwinter Nights. I scripted that plus the Wizard's Tower. I did the AI script for Neverwinter. I did all the spells. I did all that sort of stuff. So I got to do a broad range of stuff. And it's sad because when I went on to Star Wars, and I spent a year doing all of that same stuff, but just in that, okay, we're finishing this game and we need help just figuring out this stuff. But when I list the stuff that I did on something like Star Wars, it's like I scripted the Ebon Hawk, I scripted all of the cinematic scenes, I scripted the AI, feats, spells / force powers, all that stuff I had to do. It was a simpler time where you could do that, where one person could do those things, right? Now, where AAA games are it takes a lot more people to be able to pull off all of that stuff. And frankly, you want that kind of focus anyways. You want to be able to say, like, I am the best, creature designer in the world, or the best whatever. So I would say, as a developer, it was Neverwinter, but as a lead, it was Mass Effect 2. For sure.
Obviously, your titles have been within RPGs, like specifically, and again, listen to you like you growing up, and like especially focusing on IPs of Star Wars and D&D and how these have like influenced your career. It must be incredibly cool to work on games within those universes. Do you find it hard to stay consistently inspired though when you're working within the same genre?
No, not really, because I love the genre. But then when you say RPG now, it's almost a meaningless statement. Like, how many subgenres of RPG have grown up? Like, you have looter shooters and action RPGs, and now I would almost say traditional RPGs, right? Like your Divine Divinities and whatnot. You have so many different genres of RPG, and they're all contributing to the broader genre becoming better. And so you can look at a game like an indie RPG or like a Dead Cells game, and you're like, whoa, that's really cool what they're doing there. You look at this other game over here, built by 3 guys, and you're like, wow, they are doing some really amazing stuff. It's the fact that the broader genre has exploded out into all of these little subgenres, and they're all exploring one sort of almost aspect of the broader genre. They're saying, okay, Diablo 3, for instance, I love progression, and we're going to make the best progression action game ever. Okay. And then they did. And then you have you have Dark Souls, which is like, well, we're going to make a game focused on challenge and difficulty and whatever. And again, so successful that it's become its own subgenre of game and stuff like that. So it's easy to stay in the genre because the genre keeps expanding. Like what it means to be an RPG. So if I ask you this question, is Assassin's Creed Odyssey an RPG? I ask the question because you don't really know, right? Like I have an opinion, but what do you think?
For me, when I look back, I think you're right. I think like the genre's like, it's completely expanded. Like you have action RPGs with like Diablo, Lost Ark, and games like this. And then I look at like narrative-led, like The Witcher, I would still say is a traditional RPG because it's a narrative-led experience where you make decisions. I almost try and picture like traditional RPG in the sense of a D&D campaign on your own and what has the most aspects of that. Because in D&D, you wouldn't just run around attacking people because, well, you wouldn't really get anywhere and you would just die quite quickly.
I think, though, and that's a very interesting comment, but I think the problem is that people play RPGs for different reasons. And back in the day when there was only, one RPG every 3 years, you'd be like, okay, this is the next RPG and I'm going to play it. BG2 comes out and then that's it. So if you wanted to get a great story, you would play BG2. If you wanted great progression and, I want to make these different builds, you'd play BG2. But very quickly, you get now, okay, well, there's this little game comes along called Diablo. It basically said, well, I'm gonna take those components and I'm gonna put a different emphasis on them. I'm gonna place a different emphasis on a part of the RPG that is different from what a BG2 is doing. And as a result, those two things then head off in different directions. They have a lot of elements that have similarities, but they head off in different directions. And so it's incredibly interesting to see where that emphasis is, but it also makes it harder. It makes it easier then for people, a customer, to go, I like games about progression. Therefore, I'm going to play Diablo 3 or I'm going to play a Destiny 2, where the emphasis is then put on the thing that I love. And so when you say story, there are people out there that are like, I want story. I want it to be super immersive. I want to have virtual friends that I care about and that are put in peril. And there's a group of people like, no, that's what an RPG is to me. So it's again, you have to be careful about when you say, well, I want to play an RPG. The person who's listening might say, oh, okay, well, yeah, you want a game where I get to level up and build the best fighter so I can kill more monsters to get more loot, to get a better sword so I can kill bigger monsters. There's people out there that are like, that's what an RPG is. But it now has become, I think, more about, okay, if you're going to talk about role playing has to have some kind of narrative element to it. It has to have some kind of emotional resonance where you feel like you have choice and consequence. That
I feel like that with like a Disco Elysium, I feel like is very much an RPG, traditional RPG game, even though there's like no real combat in it, because it is all just choice and it is all narrative led. I could talk about this for hours.
And a really great narrative series of narrative innovations there, where they say, we're going to focus on this. And because we're focusing on this game is for a certain part of that audience. Right?
Yeah.
And the people who want that, boom, they drive right towards it. They don't have to try and sift through a larger experience that's kind of half doing what they want. They can go right to that game and get what they want out of it.
And whereas Diablo's the other side of that, where it's like, actually, here's the loot, here's the progression.
Okay, I'm going to steer us back, loving all this RPG talk, but I also want to make sure we cover the story arc, right? Of like, now you've been at BioWare for 2 decades. Why have you stayed? I think part of the answer you've given us, they take good care of you.
So I love the genre. I love RPGs. I love the genre. But the reason why I stay at BioWare is the happy sort of parallel is that it's my home city. I'm lucky enough to be able to work in the city I grew up in. That's not the primary reason. The primary reason is the games I get to build and the people I work with. That is the reason you stay someplace, is that you are given the opportunity to grow. You're given the opportunity to learn. You're given the autonomy to make decisions and sort of grow the way you want to grow. And BioWare's always supported me in that. They ask me to go, like, I don't choose my next project. They're like, hey, we'd like you to go do this. But generally when they do that, I'm like, yeah, I'm excited about doing that. That sounds like a really cool project. It sounds really interesting. It's never like, oh man, I got to go help out on a game with science fiction stuff set in the future. Like, that never happens. Every game we build at BioWare is a game that I would willingly work on or help out on. But as a lead, there are developers that have like twice as many credits as I do because they actually get to work on every single one of our games. They move from project to project and they get to work on everything. Whereas as a lead, I can sit on a project for an exceptional, like in 20 years, I've done 6 games. It's that combination of all those things that get me to stay. I'll be honest, I do not feel like I wear the ring of power. I feel more like my philosophy over the last 20 years has been come in every single day and try not to get fired. And that's just been working out for me for the last 20 years. You always have some little bit of a have I been just really lucky? Like, why am I allowed to do this job? Why am I allowed to still work here for 20 years? And I think part of anybody who's reasonably successful is because you're always kind of doubting. You're like, well, hey, I could be doing this better, or you have to be very
staying hungry. So. Every single time that my one-to-one with my boss, like time gets changed or anything strange happens with it, I'm like, this is it. Today's the day I'm getting fired. I knew it was coming. Because today's finally the day.
I don't think everyone has that, but there is a place of like constant doubt in everything you do. And I think that's why you double check it.
There's a version of it where, you could call it imposter syndrome to a certain extent. And it's actually, if you keep it in check and you put it in its proper place in the tickle trunk and keep it tiny, it's one of those things where you can use it as a force for positive. Because you are constantly kind of questioning yourself. As long as you don't let it cripple your decision making and you don't let it cripple your confidence, it's a positive thing, right? It's like a double-edged sword. If you let it go too far one way, you're crippled by your own anxieties and whatever. But if you let it go the other way, it's just, no, you know what? I'm going to seek feedback out on this idea because I'm not 100% sure. Or I could have done better there. How could I have done better? And then you incorporate those learnings. Just if you're in that feedback loop of just constantly wanting to learn and improve and get better, then I think you potentially don't go into work one day and get fired. Obviously, economic catastrophe aside, but I joke, but I've been working at BioWare for 20 years and I'm literally still learning. You work with so many talented people and then you're like, wow, that person knows so much more than I do. I'm just going to listen. You know what I mean? Whenever you can work at a place where there are teachers, you're already halfway there.
And it is important that knowledge comes from both ways. So often when you're growing up, you're taught that knowledge comes from the top down. You have your expert and then they like teach you down, like your teacher teaches you and you have your textbooks. But actually, I think once you like carry on, as you go through like learnings and through your career, like so much of your knowledge actually comes from like a sphere around you. Like it's coming from all positions.
Well, I think that's one of the great things about if you're a designer, your job is not to create all the ideas. Your job is to be a shepherd for good ideas. So I don't care where a good idea comes from. One of the major changes I made to a game one time was a temp QA guy who was only on a year contract. He came in and he said, why have you done this way? And I kind of looked at him and I was like, I don't have a good answer for you because you've just given me a better idea, right?
Oh, that's a great way to frame it.
Like you have to be able to take in all, like I said at the beginning, no idea gets into the game unfiltered, nor should it. There are very few what I would call true geniuses out in the world where it's like, I have a singular vision for what I want. Even the story about the iPhone that I literally just learned a few days ago, which is Steve Jobs thought it was a terrible idea. He thought it was a terrible idea, the iPhone. And then he had all of these super creative engineers and artists and whatever. And they said, listen, we really think this could be something. And he's like, who wants all this stuff? But then eventually they convinced him. And once he understood it and once he was behind it, then you see now he becomes that driving force that takes it from something that is, a great idea to market leader, market smashing concept, right? So you have to be able to be humble about your own ideas and understand that a guy right off the street could have a better idea than you because he was just drinking a Slurpee and he had a moment of clarity and boom, there's a better idea. The creative process is one of those things where the harder you think about something, the worse you know it is, right? It's just like when you're sitting there rocking in your chair and it's like, okay, I got to be super creative and come up with an amazing idea. You're like,
get creative.
You're not coming up with a great idea. You might as well go for a walk or take a shower or go clean the dishes because it's not happening, right? I think John Cleese actually just wrote a book on creativity, which is supposed to be really, really good. And that's kind of the core premise of it, which is creativity does not come from concerted thought. It comes from those moments where your brain kind of drifts away and then comes back, like stuff like that, right? So and I found that just designing things, the harder I try to design something, I kind of go, this feels forced. And when it feels forced, it's probably not a great idea. And the ones that felt forced and then got into the game, oof.
Yeah. You have I think one of my personal slogans lately has been, if something isn't a yes, it's a no. Like the stuff that you're saying maybe to is actually a no. You're just trying to be polite. You always know when it's a yes. Something's a yes and you're like, yes, we got it. This is it.
But it's like getting hit by lightning, right? Like when you hear a great idea, you kind of sit up and you're like, wow, that's a great idea. When you hear an okay idea, you're like, well,
yeah, sure.
Let's pat that back and forth like a cat with a ball. We'll get to something mundane and sort of okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And to be fair, creatively, my entire job is about having to defend my decisions to the team. So if anyone comes to me and says, I don't like that idea, and they're never that forceful about it. They're like, well, I kind of thought I'd maybe mention something that was bugging me. And I'm like, yeah, let's go. Let's have a conversation about it. Unless it's a senior designer, then they just come to me and pounce. But I want them to do that, right? Because my whole job is to defend the thesis of the design of the game. And if I can't do that to some person who's just walking up to me off the team, who's being reasonably respectful, how am I supposed to have confidence in that thesis when it goes out to the public? And as we know, the public can be slightly unkind to something that doesn't feel right. You have to be able to take those kinds of creatively hard questions, like, why did you do this? And you also have to be able to say, well, because I made a bad decision. Yeah. I'm wrong. And you've just shown me that I'm wrong. And while I don't like that, now show me a path whereby the game gets better. It's that singularity of effort. It's that point where 500 people are all marching towards that same point to deliver something out to the public that is completely subjective. I mean, there's two really great documentaries that showcase that there's a similarity to the creative process when you're all working as a team to deliver a singular thing. It's called The September Issue and the Frozen 2 documentary that's on Disney Plus right now. They are not about game development, but man, it feels like game development when I watch those documentaries about all these people having to coordinate, and then, like the creative director for Vogue having to deal with Hannah Winter, and they love each other, but they're fighting. And, it's just like, wow, that's just.
I think collaboration within creativity is one of the best ways to get interesting things, interesting art. But man, is it hard. It's so hard to share creative vision and to align and to incorporate, like when you do have a strong creative vision, to incorporate other views and not have that feel like it's changing what you wanted to make.
It's an altitude thing for me. Like vision sits up at this level where there's vision, but not direction. There's a zone there where if you drift too far down, now you're giving direction. It's like, well, I want it blue and I want that guy to go this and the level needs to be, you know what I mean? And that's probably not the kind of stuff I should be saying. because there's somebody out there who knows that better than I do. There's a lead level designer or a level design director who knows more about level design than I'll ever know. There's art directors, animation directors. All those people understand their crafts better than I can. And so what I'm trying to do is you give them vision so that they all kind of go, all right, I'm going to apply my particular genius to that vision. And hopefully at the end, something results, right? And when it works, it's pretty magical because you feel like you've done something and nothing simultaneously, because it's like, I did none of that work, but yet it's exactly what I wanted. That's the happy moment as someone in my position, as someone who's has a large team doing a bunch of work. It feels great when that happens. Like you really do feel like, oh, I actually contributed. They got it. Like what I was saying wasn't just, and let's be clear, I say a lot of stuff that just is nonsensical and just bounces off. And then I kind of go back to my office and go, ooh, that failed. Man, I got to reframe that. Like, and then you go back to it again.
You're in a meeting and you say something that's just dead silence and you're like, yeah, cool. Okay. Another idea from someone else then.
It's the gap between the idea that lives in your head. Like I've seen creative people struggle with this problem, which is there's a great idea in your head, and in your head, it's fully formed, but it's actually not. It's in a sort of dream state where you've filled in all the blanks, right? And then you go, and now I'm going to describe that great idea. But unfortunately, you need to use words and images, or PowerPoint to try and get that idea across. And you realize at that point, if you've done it enough times, oh wait, that's actually not a fully formed idea. That's a half idea that shouldn't have even ever become a half idea. It's a terrible idea, right?
Yeah. The moment someone asks a question, you're like, oh, I have no idea. Yeah. I don't know what I'm talking about. I just realized it.
That's a pinata full of garbage. What? Why are we even talking? Let's move on. This is
skip it.
I'm actually going to bring it back to the system side of things. Sorry, it's just obviously we're trying to cover so much in such a short period of time. So this is a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to try and articulate it as best I can. But essentially, with video games being the most popular entertainment medium and RPGs having one of, if not the most vocal communities, how do you navigate implementing evolving societal and political themes and systems into these worlds without offending or being safe? And I suppose a good example of that would be like, often with these games at the beginning, you create a character, right? And you have your stats, and that's one of the best things about RPGs compared to, say, an action game where you're playing a protagonist who you don't get to do that with. But say gender and physicality are often just like aesthetic choices. How do you evolve that, right? So they actually have a system in the game where if you're, I don't know, say you're a man, you create your character as a man, you walk into a bar and there's like an alpha male NPC there and he treats you like a bro, like quotation marks. But then if you're a woman, you walk into the same bar and actually the man tries to harass you. How do you create a safe system without offending, but at the same time evolve it? It's a long question.
Well, that one's a tough one. And science fiction makes it easier because I think when you say that when you're building a science fiction universe, I think you want partly, unless it's like a super dark universe, which Mass Effect is not, right? Like Mass Effect, for instance, is a more aspirational. It's like, hey, that's a science fiction world I'd actually want to live in, killer robots aside. But it's aspirational in the sense that what you want is that gender, race, sexuality, that's just not a thing anymore. It's like they've evolved. It's an aspirational IP where those things are not an issue anymore. However, part of what science fiction is supposed to do is shine a lens on today. If you want to have a story about racism or sexism or something like that, it's easy to do in science fiction in a way where you're like, I'm going to tell you what I hope is an interesting story where you're going to have to think about things potentially from another viewpoint or angle that maybe challenges your bias, because your bias is rooted in the now and the today and the real world experience that you may have, which could be unkind. Either you are unkind, or it could be that you have had unkind things done to you, right? And so what science fiction does is it allows you to tell a story where both sides of that equation potentially look at that issue and go, oh yeah, I never really thought about it like that before. But you can sort of scramble the elements of it in a way where if you do it well enough, you can get both sides to then hear the story from the same perspective, versus the sort of echo chamber version that you might get.
Yeah, that's a crazy responsibility, isn't it? When you think about how many people will play your games and can interpret these. And I guess this comes back to your statement at the beginning about making a game is so hard now because they reach so many people and there's so many perceptions about what you create.
You just need to, again, it's back to trying to create an authentic experience. And you don't always succeed. And sometimes you do the opposite of succeeding, which is you can fail spectacularly. But there's always that effort there. Like, I've never seen anyone approach one of these topics before and go, well, I'm not going to give this the weight that it's due. I'm going to throw a story about racism out there and not really think about the implications of it, or really not think that, hey, this is something that matters to a lot of people and it should matter to everyone. I'm going to treat it with the respect that it's due. I've never seen anyone in my 20 years go, yeah, I'm just going to whip this story out and not really care about how it lands. Right.
That's really good.
So do you think when those mistakes are made, it comes from a place of ignorance versus malintent?
I don't know about that even. I think it's just sometimes you get it out there and it doesn't land authentically with a certain part of the audience. And that's like anything. You can put a game out and the entire game might not land with the audience, right? So it's one of these things where I'm constantly surprised about what plots resonate or don't resonate with fans. There are plots that were throwaway, that we spent a little bit of time on, and they weren't like meant to be this gigantic, whatever, but they really resonate with people because they feel authentic, right? There's a plot in ME1, and it's a super tiny little plot on the Citadel about a man who wants to get the remains of his wife, and he wants you to go talk to the guy. His wife is a soldier, and she was killed by the Geth, and they want to retain her body because we can learn about Geth weapons and stuff like that. And he wants you to go retrieve that body. That felt like, when you're in that moment, the voice acting, the cinematic design, everything came together and made you feel like, wow, I actually really feel for this guy. It actually feels like an authentic experience, right? Other times they just don't land. And it can be a combination. The writing could have been brilliant, but it just doesn't, it just doesn't land, or it just doesn't whatever. And there's a lot of different factors that can go into that. But when it works, you get those really powerful emotions coming out of it, right? So
yeah, I think actually, Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect as a series is incredibly good for that, inspiring those emotions. Obviously, with RPGs, often they implement like a morality mechanic. And when this was first a thing, it was huge, especially with things like Star Wars, and it was so iconic with Star Wars because it's so easy to look at the Sith and the Jedi and be like, associate yourself with one of those two moralities, which tends to be, unfortunately, for everything else, that's actually relatively linear. Like, you have your good, your bad, and your neutral. And this barometer to relay what you're doing can sometimes feel a bit restrictive, I guess, in what people's choices can be. A good example would be what you said with your feedback regarding the bug for Baldur's Gate and the Paladin. And you didn't want to be a rogue for 5 minutes to complete a quest. Like, can't you just be a Paladin? Do you think it'll ever be possible to have a broader morale mixture? And I think of characters like Thanos, Darth Vader, Walter White from Breaking Bad, where they're technically bad people on the face of things, but actually all of them kind of have these they're multi-layered characters because they actually have good intentions or come from a place of, this makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so there's kind of two parts to it. One is the production side of it, which is, can you create, so in a role-playing game, it means you have choice. And so if you're giving me the choice to play a bad guy, you need to give me the choice to play a good guy then, right? Mm-hmm. So again, it comes down to authenticity, complexity, and cost. So it's possible to do those things, but is it actually really possible because of like, okay, well, we need this many people working much longer to do it. And then you have the telemetry feedback telling you, but 93% of your audience play good guys. What you would want then is a story where you may have less choice in the story itself, but potentially you get to go on the journey you're talking about. Right? I want to play a game. And The Last of Us 2 had a little bit of this, right? Where you're playing from both, spoiler alert, but you're playing from both perspectives. And there are moments in that journey where you do not feel good about the character that you are inhabiting and playing with, right? But that story doesn't have choice in it. And so they take the choice element and reduce it down to, I'm going to tell you one of the best stories ever in a video game. And you're like, okay, so they've taken it feels authentic, but they've reduced the complexity and they've kept the cost. Right? It's not the answer you want, which is like, possible. And I'm writing it down right now. It's the idea that you have to make everything as a trade-off. Like, game design is about trade-offs and compromises, right? If you've ever been at the beginning of a project where everything is possible, this and this and this, and then especially when you're younger, where it is all possible, and then you get kind of older and you realize you instantaneously see the cost in something. If we did this, when we did Mass Effect 1, we had this, we have this little moment with Ashley and Caden partway through the game where you have to make a tough choice, right? However, to the developers, that choice was a cost that we carried for the rest of that game, right? For the rest of that trilogy, one of those two people could always be with you. So every scene they were in was duplicated. Every single thing, it was worth the cost, because it's still an exceptionally galvanizing moment when you have to choose, right? But you have to always look at these things. There is always can we do it and do it in a way where it's going to feel authentic? Yeah. And sometimes you get to that point where you've made, okay, you get to make these choices, and then you realize, yeah, but it just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like we did it justice. And if you're not doing it justice, that's where I think then you open yourself up to it's like, well, that didn't feel good. It didn't feel, and I don't think anyone's going to say it didn't feel authentic, but they're going to tell you this didn't feel right. It just didn't feel, good that you allowed me to go down this path and then didn't pay it off. You didn't do it justice, right? Now, one thing, that you might ask is like, well, if 93% of people are playing good guys, why are you doing bad guys at all? Because the power of being a good guy comes from being able to be bad, right? If you take Renegade away, Paragon, then what really is Paragon? Yeah. Right? It's the ability to know that in this moment, you're like, oh man, I could totally shoot that guy. I'm Commander Shepard, and I could just shoot that guy and no one would care, and because I'm a Spectre. But then as a player, you're like, but I feel bad. I don't want to feel bad. I want to be the good guy. And so you don't make that choice. Right? One of the points of feedback we got on Mass Effect 1 was that people are like, okay, it's just another, a space game and I'm Commander Shooty. But there's a moment when you get back onto the Normandy from your first mission with Ashley. And there's a throwaway line there where she says something, and then you can be angry, you can be mean to her. And players were like, hey, I'm going to be mean to Ashley because it's meaningless. Well, then she reacts to you. She looks like, oh man, like she looks crestfallen and sad. And for a lot of players,
that is one of my favorite words lately. Crestfallen. Good use of that word.
She looks like what you said mattered. And now people are like, oh, wait, you mean I can make people sad by being a jerk? Yep. As soon as you've humanized it and you've made it something like, for the 93% of us that like generally don't want to be a bad person and want to be good, they don't want to go out there and stomp around being kind of a jerk, right? I always found it incredibly difficult to test the Renegade path of the game.
Yeah, you're a paladin, aren't you? So
I like playing all classes, but I generally like to play. Yeah, I like to play the good guy, right? That's why I show up for an RPG. Is epic fantasy fulfillment. You get to be a hero and stuff. So I'm playing through as Renegade Shepard, and it's just like, oh man, like I feel so bad, playing Renegade Shep. So I almost had to. I have to go and say, does anyone love playing Renegade? Because I need your feedback. Because I'm just getting hammered here emotionally. Like this is a tough playthrough for me, and I generally do like 9 to 12 playthroughs of our game before we ship, so that I can test different class paths and different choices, different romances. You know what I mean? It's a matter of, if you're going to do it the way that you're saying, like, I want to be Walter White. And I think Walter White is a great example, because he goes on a journey, right? He goes on a journey from being like, I'm a regular guy with regular problems and they're overwhelming. And then, and then, 6 to 8 seasons later, bad things happen to him, right?
Yeah. Thing is, when he is a regular guy, he's not that likable. Like, he's just sort of, for me, I was like, okay, yeah. I don't know. Like, he almost had to go bad to be complex enough for me to care about him.
Do you know what though? Like, I completely agree. And maybe I suppose that comes to Preston's point about having if you don't have the good, you can't have the bad. I think the thing is though, like, with good characters, you genuinely feel an emotion for, whether it's empathy or like, hey, happiness. There's always, it's because they're layered in such a way. And I think Breaking Bad's probably one of the best examples of characterization with Walter White's journey, and actually Jesse's as well. So yeah, for me, it's like, how do we create that in a game? Maybe it's giving neutral, so you have good and bad, but maybe it's giving neutral greater consequence. Sometimes neutral doesn't really have a focus within that.
Well, the other way that you can do it is to use the villain as a mirror. And the villain, if the villain is done properly, and a villain like, for instance, Killmonger from Black Panther has a very specific, I think the term that I've heard is thesis and antithesis, is that Black Panther has a very specific thesis about what he thinks the world is, and Killmonger has an antithesis to that. And the interesting thing, though, is that Black Panther then goes on this journey and he actually does adopt the antithesis, but not Killmonger's. And that's an interesting journey as a character. So if you can set that up, if you can set it up that your villain is interesting and human and not cartoonish, then your hero gets to go on a journey where the villain is actually challenging him on his preconceptions about being a hero and right and wrong and all these other things, right? And again, science fiction is an ideal setting to be able to put the player into circumstances that challenge them morally, right? Not just tough decisions. Like, it's like, do you want to go path A or path B? But those moments are like, they're very, very hard to craft. An A-B choice still has to be set up correctly, right? Execution. A good example is the twist for KOTOR. You have that big moment, the big reveal moment, about halfway through the game. And when you read it on paper, a lot of the team were like, that's it? That's the twist? And it's still regarded as one of the better twists out there, right? Like, where you're like, what? And so, but the thing is, it all came down to the execution. It's Drew Karpyshyn writing amazing dialogue. It's Casey Hudson having a vision for what he wanted that moment to be. It's the technical artist who worked like weeks trying to figure out how to do that moment to do it justice. The music, everything, right? All the gameplay leading up to it. That's what makes it a great moment. And those moments are hard. They take a lot of work and a lot of thought. And sometimes they just don't land. No matter what you do, it feels forced or it feels artificial. On paper, it sounded good, but then, it just doesn't land. That one landed.
That was amazing. I don't want to ruin it for anyone who hasn't played it, because it's such a good game. And it's like it is like the defining moment, I would say, of that series. Yeah. Okay. I honestly could talk about this for ages, because it's like, I really do want it to get to a point where I could have the equivalent of a Walter White conscience, but I'm going to have to move forwards. So we touched upon this earlier, obviously, the Souls games. I know you're a big fan of the Souls games. If you were to work on a Souls title, because they are system-wise, they're extremely tight, what would you design differently?
So I've finished Dark Souls 1 more than 50 times. I love that game. Like, for me, a full playthrough of Dark Souls is you have to take a character through NG7 and New Game Plus 7. Now you've finished that character, right? Because you've gone to the maximum difficulty. So I love the progression systems from the original Dark Souls, because they just kept me coming back, and I just wanted to keep playing. I could play one character like 5, 6, 7 playthroughs and it felt good. But gameplay wise, I would say, if you haven't played Sekiro's gameplay is just insane. I loved the gameplay in Sekiro. So taking those two things and kind of bringing them together, I would be like, I'd have to take weeks off and just take a vacation. Sekiro was hard though. Like I will say, even saying that I've finished Dark Souls quite a few times, Sekiro was hard. Like that one, I wear that one as a badge of honor that I was able to finish that game. The last boss took me 14 hours.
Yeah, I've got so many friends who have got to the last boss and given up. Like genuinely just been like, I just can't do it. Like it's not worth the Sunday morning stress. Because everyone seems to get up on a Sunday morning, get a few hours in. But yeah.
Well, my wife had a conference, and she's like, okay, I'm going to be gone all day. I won't be back till 8:00. It's just me and you. I sat down.
I love this picture of you being like, bye, I love you, miss you so much. Okay.
Okay. And I just sat down and I just face punched that thing for 14 hours straight. And I didn't do it. I could not do it. We got home. My kids would come downstairs. Everyone, how you doing, Dad? He's like, just, and and eventually I got through it, but it wasn't until the next day. And then I beat it in half an hour. As how many times have you done that, right? Where you just you zen out and then you beat it the next day or whatever. So the Souls games, I've never had that strong of an emotional reaction to a game before. This is kind of embarrassing, but there's Smog and Ornstein are two of the most classically, like, just, you love to hate those two guys, right? In the middle of the Souls game. And they kill you so often where you have they have one pixel of health left, right? I don't know how they do it, but they always manage. You get greedy and then they kill you with that one pixel. I slammed my controller down on the desk, like so hard. I broke my controller and then the disc skipped and it scratched. And I was just like, and I got over my initial reaction. And I was like, yeah, but I want to keep playing Dark Souls. So I literally got in the car, drove down to Best Buy, bought a new controller, and they had the copy on sale for $30. I was like, okay, good. I'm back in it. And I drove back home, loaded it all up and started playing again because it's such an amazing game. I got into that game in a really weird way. Like it was during Mass Effect 2, we were in the or Mass Effect 3 in the pit there working. And it sort of was this chain reaction, like one of our QA people were playing it. And then they would turn to a friend and go, this game's amazing. You have to play it. And it kind of virally, slowly spread through the room, right? Until it got to me and I was like, okay, you guys keep talking about this game called Dark Souls. Like, what is it? It's like, well, it's hard to explain. You just have to go play it. And so I picked it up and I started playing it. And that is an unforgiving opening to that game. There's just like no explanations. Just you got to go in there and play, and you just get killed 50 times, and it can be very frustrating, right? I came back in the next day, and I went to these guys. You're gonna have to give me a really good reason not to fire all of you guys. Like seriously, what is it that you just got me into? He's like, you just gotta stick with it. You gotta stick with it. And then 2 days later, I came back and I was like, okay, yeah, this game's amazing. I love this game. It's genius. So once you get over that hump, it can be pretty amazing, right? Like even my daughter can get to the first boss when she was 8. So I was like, you're doing better than some of the guys in the office.
Luke, was it Heather Sigmund that brought up that exact arc of like, love the game, hate the game, okay, back in it? Like they talk about like this 3-tweet cadence that they always expect of like, this is the best thing I've ever played. And then just like, I hate this game, I'm never going to try it again. And then back to loving it. Wasn't that Tyler?
I think it was Tyler.
Yeah.
It's the thing that, I mean, a lot of people are like, well, why can't we have a casual mode for Dark Souls or casual mode for Sekiro? Because I want to experience the beauty of the world and whatever. But those guys are pretty firm in the fact that part of the experience of our games is the difficulty, is that ultimate satisfaction of beating a boss in that game that you've been just bludgeoning your face against for hours and hours and hours. And like they stick to their guns. They are reasonable. They are, we are not making those games easier. We make hard games and our demographic wants them to be hard and they want them to be challenging, right? So it's a tough debate.
It's weird because obviously the story is obviously very convoluted. The worlds are actually, beautiful considering, and they run reasonably well. I mean, Bloodborne maybe being the exception, but it's I think the difficulty is where the story is. It's quite clever that it's actually you playing and dying and then playing. You're like creating your own experiences. So when you do beat a boss, like that emotional uplift that you get, that is the thing that gets you hooked, because you're like, God, this is actually a real journey I'm on. It reminds me of things like R-Type and side-scrolling shooters from back in the day, like Ikaruga, which is so hard, and you need like such ridiculous agility and hand-eye coordination. But you like clock the first few levels, and you just feel like that is the thing that keeps you playing them, and like used to keep you like putting credits in the arcade.
Back in university, I used to just pick one game for the whole year. So by the end of the year, I could just put one quarter in and play for an hour to finish it. Because, you know, I didn't have any money, right? So I would be like, okay, I'm going to invest in like 1942 or UN Squadron, and that's the game I'm playing for the whole year. Back when I had arcades, but again, dating myself in university. Back in
No, don't. 1942 was amazing. Such a great game. Okay, so I'm going to just ask one of my last two questions. I think we've really touched upon like the consequences, like, you know, consequences of actions within games. I think we've covered that already. But I suppose one of the key things, and like not just RPGs, but maybe like games in general, like, or maybe story-driven games, or, you know, similar games to RPGs or the RPG umbrella. I think asking like what are the key contributors to a good RPG is too broad. So, I mean, where do you see the genre evolving? Like, how do you see it evolving? And I mean the RPGs, which are like, I guess, those similar to your isometric D&D RPGs, your Witcher RPGs, like how are they going to evolve?
So there's been an interesting evolution in RPGs in the last, you know, a sneaky evolution in the sense that, do you consider The Last of Us an RPG? Do you consider Odyssey an RPG? Do you consider God of War an RPG? I have to say, yes, they are in some respects, right? There is a blending of genres that is currently happening. You're taking the best elements from the action genre and the best elements from the RPG genre, and you're getting this really great, you know, action RPG genre. And you combine that with what I would call the rise of photorealistic art and, you know, animation systems that are very quickly catching up to that. The uncanny valley right now is animation. It's not the look that maybe puts you off, it's how things move, right? That stuff is accelerating even like super fast. Like that stuff is catching up. So what happens when you reach a point where art feels very real, like photoreal, animation feels real, and then you start making all those things cheaper. So initially it's extremely expensive and you got your rigs and your models and it takes like 6 weeks, whatever. Well, what happens when all that stuff becomes cheaper? What it means is you're going to see an explosion of some of the things that we just talked about. You're going to see an explosion in choice. You're going to see an explosion in consequence. You're going to see all of these things happen as people figure out how to reduce the cost and complexity of some of those things. Because everyone wants to make the game you're talking about. I want to put more choice into my game. I want to put more consequence into my game, but you're limited by technology and cost and complexity. Things are always going to be getting better and better and better. And then, you know, never mind VR and all these other platforms. But it's going to be that the escalating or the reduction in cost and the ability to make those moments, right, that are going to then produce like some experiences down the road that you are like, oh my God, this has the unending landscape of one of your better open RPGs, but it has the gameplay and uniqueness of a handcrafted experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those two things coming together are probably going to produce, you know, some of the great games for the middle of this decade and beyond. Like it'll happen at some point where somebody puts that game out and you're like, oh my God, I don't know how they did this.
You know, like Kratos for me, like it's like this character evolution that actually he was a bad guy back in the day. He wasn't a nice person. He like, you know, he like killed his family. He's done all these bad things. And now this latest one, it's so clever what they did was it's redemption, but he's grown up, but the game's grown up. You don't see these like as childish mechanics. The story's evolved. He's got a son, but there is still that undertone that, you used to do bad things. Like you weren't a nice person. Yeah, with that, I would say that is my personal game of the generation. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, God of War was an amazing game. I loved playing through that, and there are guys within BioWare that they have nothing but good things. So those guys produced something pretty darn special with that game. So
yeah.
So let's end on this. You have 2 decades in the industry. Are we looking at 2 more? Is there a pivot? What's next for you?
Well, that's interesting. Like, you've had a lot of guests on your show that, like, I'm astonished by the breadth of their life experience. Like, I did this and I made a game and I started a company, and then I quit and started another company, and then I went to Mars, and it's just like, wow, like, holy crap, I really do like making games. I really love the process of making games. I love design. I love designing games. And so I'll do it as long as they let me. But there is probably, you need to work pretty darn hard to finish a game. And there is probably a stamina element that will slowly creep into this process at some point where I'll go, yeah, I maybe can't do this anymore. I don't know when that will be. I'm frankly in the best shape of my life, and I'm feeling really good. So it's not like, and that's tomorrow, like it's not like it's coming, but
not like you feel it being imminent, but it's an acknowledgement that someday.
Yeah, I'm 52 years old. So as an example, 52, I definitely don't have 2 more decades left. I'll work at BioWare as long as they let me, as long as I feel I'm contributing and I'm not hanging on. But I think that there's a transition point where I should let people that are younger than me do the work that I'm doing, because they're going to have better ideas. They're going to creative understanding and knowledge about the technology that I don't have, which means they're going to come up with those new experiences. So at some point, like, does that mean I'm doing more mentoring? Does that mean that I'm doing more teaching? Right. And I like doing those things. So if at some point I do transition into that kind of work, I think that's still valuable. You can't be doing the job I'm doing without enjoying teaching and watching other people succeed. Mm. You just can't. Otherwise, you become like sort of this weird, megalomaniac who is like, micromanaging everyone. And I don't feel that, I don't feel like that's the kind of lead or boss that I am. So in order, for me to step aside and say, okay, you're going to be the next, lead designer, design director, whatever, and then have them succeed. But then, I can hopefully act as a mentor and a teacher to other people in the studio. And I do I do mentoring and I do other things. It is definitely, I'm in the latter half of my career, not the, because I started late. I didn't come into the industry till I was 30. So I started the industry late in life, and there are guys that started the same year I did, or almost the same month, that I've been working with for 20 years. I've been on like 4 or 5 projects with them, and they're 10 years, 12 years younger than I am. They're going to get to my age and still have 12, 15 years left, and I'll be retired.
I think that's a good answer, though, of you have done a lot, you're going to do more, but for this portion of your time in the industry, focusing on mentoring, growing, and listening to ideas of people who are on a growth trajectory in their careers. That's a good answer.
You got to transition at some point from, acting to be able to teach what you've learned. Right. And that's kind of like my definition of wisdom is being able to teach what you've learned. A lot of people act on instinct. It's like, I've got 10 years of experience but it's instinctual. It's just because I've done it so many times. You transition at a point, though, where you start thinking about, why did I succeed? Or why do things work the way they work? And it's when you start doing that, you can start saying, have you done this? Have you tried this? And you're teaching people to fish, not catching fish for them, right? Mm-hmm. So, people appreciate getting advice that helps them become better developers or better managers or better whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if it's, I'm going to take your advice and become better. right? They still have to do it. There's, my job is done when I've given you the advice, but hopefully you act on it and you become better as a result.
It's interesting, the parallels between that, and obviously all three of us are parents and parenthood, right? You just want to teach your kids everything you've learned, including the mistakes, but except they're going to make their own mistakes in making their own decisions. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's the toughest part of being a parent, right?
Letting them grow up.
Is trying to get them to avoid mistakes that you made, but knowing that they're probably going to have to make them.
Yeah.
You try to steer them away from anything catastrophic that you happen in. And in fact, in my life, I can say that I was able to steer clear of catastrophic mistakes.
But then you also know as a person that like who I am, I could only be because of all those mistakes and even the catastrophic ones. So then it's like, I don't want my kids to feel that pain. I don't want them to go through those things, but they can't become the person they're going to become without it.
It's unfortunate, but true, but you learn more from failure than you do from success. Right. And so being able to safely fail, and that's part of game development, which is a person will come to you with an idea and you'll go, I know that idea is going to fail, but it's a 2-week failure. So I want you to go out and you say to them, okay, why don't you go try that? I have some reservations, but I think you should go try that. And the reason is that it's not taking an entire project down. And at the end of the 2 weeks, they'll come back to you and go, hey, it didn't work, but I learned some really great stuff. And you're like, good. That's what I wanted you to do. That's what I wanted you to do. So it's keeping people from making mistakes that are like dramatically life altering or dramatically consequential. But it's like, go make a small mistake because you're going to learn a lot from that small mistake.
Well, Preston, Mr. Watamaniuk.
Perfect.
Yeah, this is a good mid-Friday chat.
Yeah. Preston, absolute pleasure.
Pleasure meeting both of you.
That was Preston Watamaniuk. Massive thank you to him for joining us, and to Kaylee for being a fantastic co-host. Just a quick reminder that all the views that you've heard today are Kaylee, Preston's, and my own, and they do not represent our employers. If you would like to reach the Game Dev Show team, feel free to email us at gamedevshow@ptw.com. And then until next week, people, stay safe.
Game over.